Hey there! Tonight we're easing into a part of the ancient world that most people never linger on for long. The quiet hours, when the body rested but the soul was believed to wander. To the Greeks, sleep wasn't simply rest, it was a fragile crossing, a moment where gods, dreams, and shadows could slip closer than daylight ever allowed. If these slow stories help you unwind or feel a little more at peace, you're welcome to like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a soft comment. Maybe just where you're listening from, or what time the night has reached you. Only if it feels gentle. So let the weight of the day fade away, settle into the stillness around you, and breathe slowly as we return to an age when sleep was treated with caution, reverence, and quiet awe, sometimes feared even more than death itself. In the shadowed folds of eternity, where the veil between suffering and oblivion thins to a single thread, a god awoke to the weight of forever, not in thunderous rebirth, but in the slow, inexorable drag of awareness that refused to fade. His eyes opened to darkness, not the merciful black of sleep, but a void alive with memory, pressing in like the walls of a tomb that breathed. He did not cry out. He simply lay there, feeling the first pulse of isolation coil around his form, tighter than chains forged in Hephaestus's fire. The council had convened at dusk on the heights of Olympus, where the light of fading day cast long shadows across the marble thrones. Zeus sat central, his grip on the scepter loose, eyes distant as storm clouds at rest. Hera flanked him, her posture rigid, fingers tracing the armrest in slow circles. Poseidon leaned forward, trident planted like a sentinel. Athena stood apart, helmet shadowing her face, Ol perched silent. Apollo tuned his lyre absently, notes hanging unresolved. Hermes paced the edges, wings furled, his usual swiftness reduced to measured steps. They spoke of Lyros, the god of forgotten oaths, keeper of promises that mortals and immortals alike whispered into the ether. He had bound fates with threads invisible, ensuring that vows held fast across realms, the oath of a warrior to his king, the pledge of lovers under starlight, the covenant between gods and men. Without fanfare, he wove the fabric of trust that allowed empires to rise, wars to end, and alliances to endure. His temple, nestled in a quiet glen below the mountain, received no grand sacrifices, only quiet murmurs from those who sought to remember or release. But Lyros had rebelled in the subtlest way. He began to loosen threads, not breaking them, but allowing slack where rigidity once ruled. Earths are chains, he had said in one hushed assembly, voice calm as a still sea. Let them breathe, or they strangle the soul. To the council, this was heresy, a threat to the order that sustained their rule. Zeus saw in it the spark of chaos, the unravelling of divine authority. The decree came quietly, not destruction. For even gods hesitated at true annihilation, but a fate woven from Lyros' own domain. Eternal awareness, bound in isolation, memory his only companion, death denied, mercy withheld. The ritual unfolded in silence. They led him to a cavern deep beneath the earth, where no light pierced and no sound echoed. Chains of adamant wrapped his limbs, not to restrain movement, but to anchor him to the stone. A veil of enchantment fell over his eyes, sealing them open, forcing perpetual sight into nothingness. His mind they left untouched, sharp, unrelenting, fed by the endless river of memories that now flowed without end. As the last god departed, the entrance sealed with a sigh of rock, Lyros felt the first true pang, not pain, but the slow bloom of solitude. At first, the world above continued its rhythm. Zeus returned to his throne, hurling bolts to affirm dominion. Hera oversaw her rites, peacock strutting in ordered grace. Poseidon stirred waves, commanding tides with effortless will. Mortals plowed fields, raised temples, whispered vows at altars. A shepherd swore loyalty to his flock under the moon. A king pledged peace to his rival across a banquet table. The oaths held for a time, echoing the remnants of Lyros's weave. But beneath the surface, the absence stirred. In the halls of Thebes, a merchant sealed a deal with a handshake, yet doubt crept in like mist at dawn. He awoke that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the words in endless loop. The promise felt hollow, unanchored. He rose, paced, returned to bed unrested. By morning, the doubt had deepened, a quiet erosion no one named. Deeper in the earth, Lyros lay motionless. His body required no sustenance. Immortality saw to that. But his mind churned. Memories surfaced unbidden. The first oath he had bound, a mortal's vow to the sea that saved a village from flood. Then another, a god's promise broken, the thread he had mended in secret. They played in sequence, but vivid as the moment they occurred, no detail faded. He tried to turn from them, but awareness held him fast. Silence pressed in, broken only by the drip of distant water. Each drop a marker of time that stretched without measure. In the underworld, Hades noticed the shift. Souls arrived at the Styx with oaths, clinging like shadows, unresolved. Charon ferried them across, but their whispers lingered on the boat, echoing promises unkept. The dead, who should have found rest, wandered the asphodel fields, murmuring vows to no one. Hades drummed fingers on his throne, Persephone at his side, her hand still on his arm. They exchanged no words. The imbalance was clear without Lyros, endings frayed. On Olympus, small fractures appeared. Apollo's prophecies blurred at the edges, futures tangled by uncertain pledges. He gazed into his pool, images rippling without wind. Athena's counsels to heroes faltered. Strategies built on alliances crumbled when trust thinned. She paced her temple, brow furrowed, attributing it to mortal weakness. Hermes delivered messages that arrived with hesitation, as if the words themselves doubted their path. Mortals felt it in rituals. A bride at her wedding altar repeated her vows thrice, voice trembling, as though the words needed reinforcement to hold. Guests nodded, but unease settled like dust. In battlefields, warriors hesitated before charging, oaths of fealty ringing hollow in their ears. Kings issued decrees that subjects followed with reluctance, the bond between ruler and ruled growing brittle. Lyros, in his cavern, felt each unravelling as a distant tug on invisible threads. Memories intensified, now not just his own, but echoes of every oath he had ever touched. They flooded in, joyful pledges, bitter curses, solemn covenants, layering upon one another without pause. He could not sleep, could not forget. Isolation wrapped tighter, a cocoon of self where only recollection lived. As moons waxed and waned above, the tension deepened. A single star in the night sky dimmed slightly, its light diffusing, as if unsure of its course. Zeus glanced upward from his throne, grip tightening on the scepter. The punishment, meant to preserve order, had planted seeds of its own undoing. And in the depths, Lyros waited, not for release, but for the next memory to rise, inevitable as the tide he could no longer see. The earth exhaled a low rumble, urging the listener deeper into the unfolding shadow of endurance. The first true unravelling appeared not in cataclysm, but in the quiet hesitation of dawn. Across the plains of Thessaly, where shepherds had always greeted first light with oaths, to the rising sun, the words caught in their throats. A young herder stood on the hill crest, mouth open, the familiar vow. I swear by Helios to guard this flock until nightfall. Forming on his tongue, then dissolving before it could take shape. He blinked, confused, then tried again. The promise emerged halting, thin, like smoke dispersed by wind. The sheep moved past him without pause, grazing as usual. Yet something in their rhythm felt looser, less certain. He watched them drift toward the ravine's edge, stepping where once an invisible boundary had held them back. One lamb paused, looked back, then continued. But the shepherd did not shout. He simply followed, slower than before, the weight of an unmoored promise settling in his chest. In the city of Mycenae, a bronze smith sealed a contract with a neighbouring forge. Hands clasped, words spoken, loyalty in trade, fair exchange, no deceit. The clasp lingered a heartbeat too long. Both men withdrew their palms and stared at them as though the skin itself remembered the vow while the mind already doubted. That night the smith lay awake, replaying the handshake in perfect detail, the warmth of the other's grip, the slight solace on the thumb, the exact pressure. Sleep came only in fragments, each fragment repeating the scene with merciless clarity. By morning the contract felt fragile, a thing of glass rather than iron. Deeper beneath the earth, Lyros remained motionless on the stone. His eyes, held open by enchantment, stared into unbroken dark. The first wave of borrowed memories arrived not as flood, but as a slow tide every oath he had ever touched, now returning to him unbound. A child's promise to a dying mother, a soldier's vow before battle, a lover's whisper at midnight. They arrived in order, each one vivid, each one complete, refusing to fade. He could not close his lids, could not turn his head. Awareness pinned him as surely as the adamant chains. Between each memory came silence, long, perfect, unbearable, broken only by the distant drip of water counting moments that no longer held meaning. On Olympus the gods moved through their days with the caution of those stepping over cracks in marble. Zeus walked the eastern colonnade at twilight, pausing at each pillar to rest a hand against the stone. He felt the faint tremor of doubt in the air, like the first tremor before an earthquake. He spoke no command. He simply stood, listening to the wind that carried fewer prayers, fewer binding words. Hera sat in her garden, her fingers weaving a garland of myrtle. Each knot she tied felt temporary, as though the stems might slip free at any moment. The peacocks circled her bench in slow procession, heads lowered, tails dragging. One bird paused directly before her, fixed her with its eye, and uttered a low note, not cry, but question. She reached out, touched its crest. The bird did not preen. It simply waited. Poseidon descended to the shore where he had once accepted oaths from sailors. The waves lapped at his feet without their usual deference. He lifted his trident, struck the sand once. The impact sent a ripple outward, but the sea did not roar in answer. It merely settled again, quieter, as though the covenant between God and element had grown thin. Athena paced her library, scrolls open on every table, strategies that once rested on unbreakable alliances, now frayed at the edges. She read one aloud. Troops pledged to hold the pass until relief arrived, and felt the words dissolve mid-sentence. She closed the scroll, opened another. The same erosion. Her owl watched from its perch unblinking. She did not speak to it. She simply continued reading, searching for the place where certainty had once lived. Apollo sat beside his sacred pool, gazing into water that no longer reflected clear prophecy. Images came: fractured battles half, fought, vows half, kept, futures dissolving into mist. He trailed a finger across the surface. The ripple spread, then stopped abruptly, as though the water itself had forgotten how to move forward. Hermes walked the paths between realms more slowly than ever. Messages he carried arrived with hesitation, as though the words doubted their own truth. He delivered one to a mortal king. Promise of victory if he honoured the gods, and watched the king's face cloud with uncertainty. Hermes turned away without jest, wings folded, footsteps heavy on the earth. In the underworld the dead grew restless. Souls arrived at the judgment seat, with oaths clinging to them like cobwebs, unresolved, unfulfilled. Minos and Rhadamanthus weighed them, but the scales tipped erratically, the balance uncertain. The shades wandered the asphodel fields, murmuring promises to one another, voices overlapping in endless repetition. Hades watched from his throne, fingers steepled. Persephone sat beside him, hand resting on his arm. They did not speak. The silence between them carried the weight of things left unsaid. Above, in the mortal world, rituals changed. Brides repeated vows 4 times instead of once. Warriors touched their swords to lips before battle, as though the steel itself needed reminding. Kings issued decrees written in triplicate, each copy sealed with fresh wax. The gestures did not restore certainty. They only prolonged the moment of doubt. Lyros, in the cavern, felt each faltering vow as a distant echo against his skin. The memories intensified, now not only the oaths themselves, but the moments after, the betrayals, the regrets, the quiet shames. They layered upon one another, a palimpsest of human frailty he could neither erase nor escape. Between each wave came the silence again, longer now, deeper, as though the dark itself were learning patience. As days stretched into weeks, the imbalance spread like frost across glass. A single star in the constellation of the oath. Bearer dimmed, its light scattering into the void. Zeus looked upward from his throne, eyes narrowing. The punishment, designed to protect order, had begun to erode the very foundation it sought to preserve. And in the depths, Lyros waited, not for release, but for the next memory to arrive, carrying with it the faint, inevitable scent of everything that had once been sworn, and now stood unmoored. The earth held its breath, urging the listener onward into the lengthening shadow of what cannot be forgotten. The 3rd month after the binding brought a stillness deeper than absence. In the hills above Delphi, the oracle's tripod stood empty for the first time in living memory. The Pythia no longer descended into the chasm. She remained above ground, seated on plain stone, eyes open and unblinking. Pilgrims arrived at dawn, laid their offerings, and waited. When they asked their questions about harvests, about wars, about promises made in haste, she answered in single words: held, broken, remembered. Each syllable fell into the silence like a pebble into a well that never quite returns the echo. The priests recorded them on wax tablets, then melted the wax at dusk. Certain the fumes had clouded her sight, yet the words lingered in their mouths, tasting of iron and regret. In the Agora of Athens, philosophers who once argued with certainty now paused mid-thought. One, renowned for his discourses on virtue, stood before his students and began a sentence about the binding nature of oaths. The words formed, then faltered. He looked down at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. The students waited without impatience. After long minutes he continued, but the argument no longer concluded. It simply drifted into silence. The young men nodded, wrote nothing, and dispersed quietly. That night the philosopher sat alone in his courtyard, staring at the moon, replaying every promise he had ever made, to teachers, to friends, to the city itself. Each one returned to him in perfect order, vivid, unrelenting. Beneath the earth, Lyros lay unchanged. The adamant chains had grown warm against his skin, as though they too were learning patience. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness, but the darkness had begun to change. It thickened in places, thinned in others, forming faint shapes that suggested doorways, corridors, thresholds he could never reach. Between the waves of memory came longer intervals of nothing. Not emptiness, but a waiting so profound it felt like another form of presence. He did not struggle. Struggle required hope of change. Instead he endured, each breath measured, each heartbeat a quiet acknowledgement of time's slow passage. On Olympus the gods withdrew further into themselves. Zeus no longer hurled thunderbolts. He stood on the highest terrace at midnight, hands clasped behind his back, gazing downward. The world below appeared unchanged. Lamps flickered in windows. Smoke rose from hearths. Yet he felt the subtle fraying beneath the surface, like a tapestry losing thread one strand at a time. He turned once, slowly, as though expecting to see Lyros standing behind him. The terrace remained empty. He exhaled, the sound lost in the wind. Hera walked her garden paths alone. The myrtle bushes she had tended for centuries now dropped leaves without reason. She knelt, gathered them one by one, pressed them between her palms until the scent filled the air. The peacocks followed at a distance, no longer strutting, only walking. When she paused, they paused. She did not speak to them. She simply continued gathering, leaf by leaf, as though each one carried a fragment of a promise she had once believed unbreakable. Poseidon sat motionless on the cliffs above the sea. The waves came and went, but their rhythm no longer answered his mood. He trailed his fingers through the salt spray. It clung, then fell away without obedience. He lifted his trident, held it horizontal, watched the moonlight slide along the prongs. No tremor passed through the metal, no surge rose from the deep. He lowered the weapon again, rested it across his knees, and waited. Athena remained in her chamber, surrounded by maps and scrolls. She had ceased reading them. Instead, she traced the same line over and over with her fingertip. A border that once divided allied cities, now blurred on the parchment. Her owl perched on the table's edge, head tilted. She did not meet its gaze. She simply continued tracing, the motion mechanical, endless. Apollo no longer played. He sat on the temple steps, lyre across his lap, strings untouched. He watched the sun rise, later each morning, slower each time, until its first ray touched the marble. Then he closed his eyes, not in reverence, but in recognition of something he could no longer name. When he opened them again, the light had moved on without waiting. Hermes walked the mortal roads at night. He carried no messages now. He simply moved from village to village, unseen, listening. He heard mothers pause mid-lullaby, the melody breaking as though the next note had been forgotten. He saw old men sit beside cold hearths, staring at the place where a companion once sat, though no companion had ever been removed. He saw children draw circles in the dust, perfect, unbroken, then step carefully around them. Hermes watched, said nothing, and walked on. In the mortal world the gestures of certainty multiplied. Warriors touched spear, tips to foreheads before battle, repeating oaths under their breath until the words grew thin. Brides circled altars 7 times instead of 3, each circuit slower than the last. Kings placed their hands on the same stone throne 3 times before sitting, as though the seat itself needed reminding of loyalty. The rituals did not heal the doubt. They only gave it shape, made it visible, allowed it to be carried. Lyros felt each repetition as a distant tremor against his chains. The memories now arrived not singly, but in clusters, entire lifetimes of promises layered together, overlapping, contradicting, merging into a single, unending chorus. Between the choruses came the silence again, deeper now, as though the cavern itself were breathing in time with him. As weeks turned to months, the sky itself seemed to hesitate. The moon lingered at each phase, holding fullness an hour longer, waning more slowly. Mortals looked upward and felt, without words, that something watched them back, not with judgment, but with the patience of one who remembers every vow ever spoken. On the terrace, Zeus lifted his face to the moon and asked, in a voice so low it might have been thought, "How long must we wait?" The wind carried no answer, but the silence had acquired weight. And in the depths, Lyros heard the question as clearly as if it had been spoken beside him. The listener felt the air grow heavier, the story itself pausing to draw breath before descending further into the quiet abyss of what endures without end. The 4th month arrived as a hush that swallowed sound itself. In the valleys of Arcadia, rivers no longer murmured over stones. The water flowed without ripple or song, smooth as polished obsidian, carrying leaves and twigs in perfect silence. Fishermen cast nets and watched them sink without splash. When they drew them up, the catch lay still, eyes open, gills motionless yet alive. They returned the fish to the water one by one, hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of something unspoken. The river accepted them without protest, without farewell. In the temples of Corinth, priests performed the morning libations with gestures grown mechanical. Wine poured from golden ewers into shallow basins, but the liquid did not swirl. It settled instantly, flat and reflective, mirroring the priest's face back at him with merciless clarity. He looked into his own eyes, older than he remembered, lined with doubt, and poured again. The second offering behaved the same. The third. On the fourth pour, he paused, cup suspended, and stared at the surface until his reflection began to blur at the edges, as though even the image of himself had grown uncertain of its boundaries. Beneath the earth, Lyros felt the change as a subtle shift in pressure against his skin. The adamant chains no longer felt cold. They had warmed to the temperature of his own body, indistinguishable now from flesh. His eyes, still forced open, gazed into darkness that had acquired texture, faint striations, like veins running through the void, pulsing in slow rhythm with his own heartbeat. Memories continued their procession, but now they arrived more slowly, each one lingering longer before the next took its place. A single oath could occupy hours, the exact timbre of a voice, the precise angle of a raised hand, the faint scent of olive oil on skin. He could not hasten their passage. He could only witness. On Olympus the gods moved as though under water. Zeus descended the long stair to the great hall and paused at the threshold. The eternal flame burned steadily, yet its light seemed reluctant to travel far. Shadows pooled deeper in the corners. He stepped inside, sandals silent on marble, and walked the length of the chamber without purpose. At the far end, he stopped before the empty seat that had once belonged to no one in particular, yet now felt conspicuously vacant. He rested a hand on the armrest. The stone was cool, unresponsive. He withdrew the hand slowly, as though afraid it might leave a mark. Hera remained in her garden, but the myrtle had ceased dropping leaves. The bushes stood rigid, branches fixed in mid-motion, as though time had decided to spare them further change. She knelt anyway, fingers brushing the soil, searching for the pulse of growth she had once taken for granted. The peacocks sat in a loose circle around her, heads lowered, eyes half closed. One bird shifted its weight, a single feather drifting to the ground without sound. She watched it fall, waited for it to settle, then reached out and placed it carefully beside the others. Poseidon walked the empty shore at twilight. The tide had withdrawn farther than usual and refused to return. He stood ankle, deep in wet sand, watching the line where water met earth remain fixed. He lifted one foot, set it down again. The imprint filled instantly with water that did not move. He lowered his trident until the prongs touched the surface. No ripple answered. He held the weapon there for a long time, then lifted it once more and turned inland without looking back. Athena sat motionless in her chamber. The maps lay open, but she no longer traced lines. Instead she stared at the place where all borders converged into blank parchment. Her awl had left its perch, and now rested on the table directly before her. Wings folded tight. She extended a finger toward it. The bird did not flinch. It simply regarded her with unblinking eyes. She withdrew the finger, rested both hands in her lap, and waited. Apollo remained on the temple steps until full dark. The lyre lay beside him, untouched. When the first stars appeared, he lifted his face to them. The constellations had not drifted, yet their light felt thinner, as though filtered through something he could not name. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the stars had not moved. He exhaled once, the breath visible in the cooling air, then rose and walked inside without the lyre. Hermes no longer walked the roads. He stood at the edge of Olympus, wings folded, gazing downward. The mortal world lay quiet, lamps dimmed early. Voices hushed before midnight. He lifted one foot as though to step forward, then set it down again. The gesture repeated twice more before he turned away. In the mortal world, the rituals had grown sparse. Warriors no longer touched steel to lips. Brides circled altars only once, then stopped, uncertain. Kings sat on thrones without preamble. Decrees issued in brief sentences that ended abruptly. The gestures of certainty had not been abandoned. They had simply become unnecessary. Doubt no longer required reinforcement. It had settled in like dusk, soft, pervasive, complete. Lyros in the cavern felt the slowing of the world as a corresponding slowing within himself. Memories arrived now at wider intervals, each one a small eternity. Between them the silence stretched, vast and unbroken, teaching him the true shape of forever. Above, Zeus stood once more on the terrace. He lifted his hand, palm open to the night sky. The moon, almost full, hung motionless. And in the depths, Lyros heard the silence answer with its own patient weight. The listener felt the hush deepen, the story itself holding still before the next inevitable step into what cannot be undone. The 5th month arrived without ceremony, as though time itself had grown weary of marking its own passage. In the lowlands of Boeotia, the fields lay still under a sky that refused to change colour. Dawn bled into noon without gradation. The sun climbed, held its place, then descended in the same muted gold. Farmers stood at the edges of their wheat, sickles in hand, waiting for the familiar urge to swing. It did not come. Instead, they lowered the blades, walked the rows slowly, touching each stalk as though greeting an old friend who had forgotten their name. The grain stood tall, heads heavy, yet no wind moved them, upright, patient, as if ripening had become a private vigil rather than a natural conclusion. In the streets of Thebes, market stalls opened at the usual hour, but voices never rose above a murmur. Merchants arranged their wares, olives in shallow bowls, bolts of indigo wool, small bronze figurines, and stepped back. Buyers approached, lifted items, turned them in their hands, set them down without haggling. Coins changed palms in silence, the clink absorbed by heavy air. When a purchase was complete, both parties lingered a moment longer than necessary, eyes meeting without recognition, then parted without farewell. The stalls emptied slowly throughout the day, not because goods were sold, but because the need to possess had grown thin. Beneath the earth, Lyros felt the world's deceleration as a corresponding slackening within his own awareness. Memories no longer arrived in orderly procession, but drifted in soft layers, like veils drawn one across another, until the original image blurred into something new and indefinable. A single oath could stretch across hours, its details expanding, the texture of a spoken syllable, the exact warmth of breath against skin, the faint tremor in a voice betraying hidden fear. Between these expanded recollections came silences so vast they seemed to contain entire lifetimes of waiting. He did not resist them. Resistance required movement, and movement had long since become irrelevant. On Olympus the gods had ceased to gather. Zeus remained on the western terrace from dusk until the stars appeared, then until they faded again. He no longer paced. He stood, hands loose at his sides, robe untouched by wind. The sky above him held the same pale blue it had worn for days. He lifted his eyes to it once, held the gaze, then lowered them again. No thunder stirred in his chest. No lightning flickered along his fingertips. He simply waited, as though the act of waiting had become its own form of dominion. Hera sat beneath the myrtle trees, back straight, the hands folded in her lap. The peacocks had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around her, tails folded, heads resting on breasts. They breathed in unison, slow and deep. She did not stroke their feathers. She did not speak. She watched the leaves above her remain motionless, even when the faintest current of air passed. Through the garden, one leaf trembled once, then stilled forever. She noted it without reaction. Poseidon had returned to the abyssal plain. He stood among blind creatures that drifted past without awareness of his presence. The currents moved sluggishly, brushing his ankles like silt drawn across stone. He planted his trident in the silt and left it there, upright, unmoving. Then he walked away, deeper into the dark, until the pressure of water became indistinguishable from the pressure of thought. Athena no longer sat in her library. She walked the corridors of her temple, footsteps measured, but each one identical to the last. The owl followed at a distance, wings silent. She paused before a single column, rested her palm against the marble, felt the faint pulse of stone that had once answered her touch with certainty. Now it remained cool, neutral, complete in itself. She withdrew her hand, continued walking, turned at the end of the hall, and began the circuit again. Apollo had left the temple steps. He sat now on the flat roof of his sanctuary, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them. The lyre rested beside him, strings slack. He watched the horizon where the sun should have set hours earlier. It lingered, a low disk of gold that refused to slip below the edge of the world. He tilted his head, studying the light until his eyes watered. Then he closed them, opened them again, and found the sun still there, unchanged. Hermes stood at the boundary where Olympus met sky. He had not moved in days. His wings remained folded against his back. He looked down upon the mortal world, fields motionless, streets hushed, fires burning low and steady, and felt the distance between himself and that stillness shrink. He lifted one hand, palm outward, as though testing the thickness of the air. The gesture hung there, suspended, then slowly fell again to his side. In the mortal world the last vestiges of ritual had fallen away. No one touched steel to lips. No one circled altars. No one repeated vows under their breath. They moved through their days with the quiet economy of those, who have accepted that certainty is no longer required. A doubt had not conquered them. It had simply become the ground they walked upon, soft, familiar, inevitable. Lyros, in the cavern, felt the final slowing as a gentle settling within himself. Memories no longer drifted, they rested, layered, complete. Between them the silence had grown so profound it felt almost like company. Above, on the terrace, Zeus drew a single breath. The moon, still almost full, held its place, and in the depths, Lyros exhaled in perfect synchrony. The listener felt the world pause, balanced on the edge of something too vast to name, waiting only for the next slow turn of what must be endured. The 6th month came as the moment when even waiting learns stillness. Across the plains of Ilis, the wind ceased entirely. No leaf trembled. No blade of grass bent. The air stood thick, unmoving, holding every scent: sun, warmed earth, distant pine, faint salt from the sea, in perfect suspension. Travellers on the road paused mid-stride, one foot lifted, then set it down again without forward motion. Horses stood with heads lowered, tails motionless. Ears pricked toward a sound that never arrived. In the fields, reapers leaned on their scythes, blades resting against wheat that refused to fall. They did not speak. They simply existed in the same suspended breath as the world around them. In the sanctuaries of Argos, the eternal lamps burned without consuming oil. Flames danced in slow, unchanging loops, casting light that did not flicker. Priests entered at the accustomed hour, knelt, and remained kneeling far longer than ritual demanded. When they rose, they moved with the deliberate slowness of men, carrying something fragile inside their chests. Offerings left on altars, pomegranates, honey cakes, small wreaths did not decay. They remained fresh, untouched by time or insect, as though decay itself had decided to wait elsewhere. Beneath the earth, Lyros felt the great pause as a corresponding quiet within. Memories no longer rested in layers, they had become a single, seamless surface, smooth as a frozen lake. Every oath he had ever touched existed now, simultaneously, joyful, broken, solemn. Whispered, shouted, all present at once, yet without conflict. The silence between them had vanished entirely. There was only the vast, unbroken awareness, calm and complete. His body, still bound by adamant, no longer registered temperature or pressure. The chains had become extensions of himself, indistinguishable from bone and sinew. He did not breathe in the ordinary sense. He simply was. On Olympus, the mountain itself seemed to hold its breath. Zeus stood on the western terrace, arms at his sides, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun remained caught at the edge of setting. The light had hardened into old gold, heavy and unmoving. He did not speak. The robe that once snapped with thunderous wind now hung still, its folds carved like stone. For the first time in eternity, the Thunderer felt the weight of his own immobility, not as victory or defeat, but as fact. Hera sat beneath the myrtle, hands open on her knees, palms upward. The peacocks had arranged themselves in a quiet circle around her, heads resting together, eyes closed. A single leaf drifted down and settled into her right palm. It did not fall. It rested there as if it had always belonged, but perfectly balanced. Poseidon stood at the water's edge. The sea lay flat to the horizon, mirror smooth beneath the frozen sky. He stepped forward until the water reached his waist and stopped. The tide did not respond. It held its level, patient and untroubled. He lifted a hand above the surface, then lowered it again without touching. The motion was not refusal, but recognition. Athena stood alone in her chamber, surrounded by blank scrolls. The owl on her shoulder remained still. At her feet lay the unstrung bow. She knelt and lifted it with care, holding it across her open palms, not to use it, not to abandon it, but to honour something that had fulfilled its purpose. Apollo sat on the roof of his temple, watching the sun that would not descend. The lyre beside him was silent, its strings slack yet heavy with memory. He brushed the wood once, then withdrew his hand. Nothing changed. It did not need to. At the mountain's edge, Hermes stood with wings folded tight. Below him, the mortal world hung suspended. Fires without smoke, rivers without sound, lives without urgency. He lifted his arms as if to greet the distance. Nothing answered. He lowered them, turned, and walked back toward the still centre of the peak, his footsteps soundless on marble. In the mortal world, the last traces of ordinary motion had fallen away. No one hurried. No one waited impatiently. They existed in the same quiet eternity as the grain in the field, the flame in the lamp, the leaf in the palm. Doubt had not disappeared. It had simply become unnecessary. The world no longer required certainty to continue. Lyros, in the cavern, but felt the universal pause as a gentle settling of everything he had ever been. Awareness had become so vast it no longer needed to focus. It simply contained all oaths, all silences, all moments of promise and fracture, without preference, without judgment. Above, on the terrace, Zeus closed his eyes. The sun, still suspended, cast its unchanging light across the mountain. And in the depths, Lyros opened his awareness wider still. The listener felt the stillness deepen into something almost tender, the story itself resting now on the threshold of what comes after endless endurance. The 7th month was not measured in days or nights. It was the long breath held before the name of mercy is spoken. In the olive groves of Attica, the fruit no longer clung. One by one, the olives released themselves. Slow drops of dark moonstone, falling through motionless air to rest on the grass without sound. Harvesters stood among the trees, baskets untouched at their feet. They watched each olive fall, as though witnessing the end of a ceremony that had lasted centuries. When the last one dropped, the branches remained extended, empty yet unbowed, as though the trees themselves had learned to carry absence with dignity. In the harbours of Piraeus, ships floated at anchor without rocking. Sails hung limp, ropes slack, hulls kissing the water in perfect stillness. Sailors sat on decks, backs against the mast, eyes open to the unchanging sky. No one called orders. No one adjusted lines. They simply remained, breathing in rhythm with the sea that had forgotten how to rise and fall. One old captain lifted his hand toward the horizon, held it there, then let it fall again into his lap. The gesture was not farewell. It was recognition that the next wave would come when it was ready, and perhaps not at all. Beneath the earth, Lyros felt the great release as a subtle loosening within the adamant. The chains had not broken. They had simply become unnecessary. His limbs remained bound, yet the pressure no longer registered. Awareness had grown so complete that it no longer needed focus. Every oath, every fracture, every moment of promise and betrayal existed now as a single, calm surface, smooth, reflective, entire. Between the layers of memory, there was no longer silence. There was only presence vast, quiet, self-contained. On Olympus the mountain exhaled once, slow, deep, final. Zeus stood on the terrace with arms open, palms upward. The sun, still suspended, cast its unchanging gold across his face. He did not speak. He did not summon wind or thunder. He simply allowed the light to rest upon him, weightless, complete. For the first time, the thunderer understood that dominion is not the power to command, but the courage to stand still while everything else decides to move again. Hera rose from beneath the myrtle. The peacocks lifted their heads in unison, tails unfolding slowly into perfect fans of iridescence. She walked among them, fingertips brushing feathers that shimmered without wind. One bird stepped forward and rested its head against her knee. She laid her palm on its crest. Neither moved. The garden held them both in the same gentle eternity. Poseidon stepped from the sea. Water streamed from his limbs, but the surface did not ripple behind him. He planted his trident in the sand one final time. The weapon stood upright, prongs catching the unchanging light, but he turned inland, walking toward the mountain without haste. The tide followed, slowly, obediently, remembering its place. Athena knelt before the unstrung bow. She lifted it, turned it in her hands, then fitted a new cord with fingers that no longer shook. The string sang once when drawn, a single, clear note that travelled outward and did not fade. She released the tension. The bow rested across her knees again, no longer a weapon, but a quiet witness. Apollo stood. He lifted the lyre. His fingers brushed the strings without pressing. A single chord drifted into the air, resolved, gentle, final. He set the instrument down. The note lingered long after his hands had fallen away. Hermes unfolded his wings. He stepped to the edge of the peak, looked down upon the world below, fields stirring now, harbours breathing, but people beginning to move again, and smiled once, small and certain. Then he lifted into the sky, not swiftly, but deliberately, carrying no message, only the knowledge that the pause had served its purpose. In the mortal world, the first faint stirrings returned. A child in a village square picked up a stone and tossed it into the air. It rose, hung, fell, struck the ground with ordinary sound. The child laughed, not loudly, but clearly. Mothers resumed lullabies mid-phrase. Fathers stepped from doorways into sunlight that moved again across the stones. Warriors lifted spears without ritual. Brides touched rings to lips once, then smiled without repetition. Lyros in the cavern felt the world resuming its rhythm as a distant, gentle pulse against his awareness. He did not rejoice. He did not grieve. He simply continued to be, aware, whole, eternal. Above, Zeus closed his hand. The sun, at last, began its descent. And in the depths, Lyros drew the longest, slowest breath of his imprisonment. The listener understood then, endurance is not punishment. It is the space in which everything forgotten is quietly remembered. The story rested now, calm, complete, on the very edge of release. The 8th month was never counted. It was the instant when eternity remembers it was once allowed to end. In the olive groves of Attica, the last olive had fallen long ago, yet the trees did not stand barren. New buds appeared, not in haste, not in defiance, but with the quiet certainty of things that have waited their proper season. They opened slowly, petal by petal, releasing a scent so faint it seemed remembered rather than real honey, earth, the ghost of every promise ever kept beneath these branches. Harvesters returned at last, baskets on their arms, footsteps soft on grass that had grown thick and forgiving. They did not hurry. They touched each new fruit, weighed it in their palms, then placed it carefully into the weave. When the baskets were full, they lifted them without strain, as though the weight of the harvest had become lighter through long patience. In the harbours of Piraeus, the first breath of wind arrived without announcement. Sails stirred, ropes creaked. Hulls rocked gently against stone quays. Sailors rose from their places on deck, stretched limbs that had forgotten motion, and began the small, necessary rituals of departure, coiling line, checking timber, but calling to one another in voices that carried ordinary joy. The old captain stood at the prow, hand resting on the rail, watching the horizon where the sun had finally slipped below the edge of the world. He smiled, not widely, not triumphantly, but with the calm of a man who has seen the tide remember its rhythm and return. Across the plains the wheat bowed at last to scythe and hand. Reapers moved through the rows in slow procession, blades singing a single, steady note with each swing. The stalks fell in soft waves, golden in the returning light. Children ran ahead, gathering fallen heads, laughing without reason, the sound rising clear and unburdened into air that moved again. Behind them the sheaves were bound, stacked, carried toward threshing floors where the grain would separate from chaff in the old, patient way. No one spoke of miracles. No one needed to. The world had simply resumed breathing. In the streets of Thebes and Mycenae, and every village between, people stepped from doorways into sunlight that travelled properly across stone. Mothers finished lullabies. Fathers lifted children to their shoulders. Warriors cleaned spearheads without ritual, then set them aside. Brides touched rings to lips once, smiled, and walked forward into ordinary days. The agora filled with voices, not loud, not frantic, but alive merchants calling wares, philosophers resuming arguments mid-sentence, children chasing one another through narrow alleys. Doubt had not vanished. It had simply become one colour among many in the tapestry of human life, present, acknowledged, no longer the only thread. Beneath the earth the cavern had changed. The adamant chains remained, yet they no longer bound. They had become part of the stone itself, veins of darker metal running through the rock, quiet witnesses rather than instruments of restraint. Lyros lay as he had always lain, eyes open. Yet the darkness around him was no longer absolute. Faint light filtered from somewhere far above, perhaps a crack that had opened in the mountain, perhaps the simple permission of time to allow a single ray to travel where it once had not. It touched his skin, pale and cool, and he felt it without surprise. Awareness had not narrowed. It had simply softened at the edges, allowing room for something new, not hope, not despair, but the calm acceptance that memory, like everything else, has its season. He drew breath, actual breath, slow and deliberate. The sound echoed softly against the walls. The first echo the cavern had known in 7 long turnings of the world. With that breath came the knowledge that he was no longer alone in his eternity. Every oath ever spoken still lived within him, complete and undiminished, yet they no longer pressed. They rested, layered, luminous, part of the same quiet surface that now included the drip of distant water, the faint warmth of returning light, the slow pulse of a heart that had learned to beat again. On Olympus the gods stood together for the first time in months. Zeus on the western terrace, arms no longer open, but resting easy at his sides. Hera beside him, one hand lightly touching his elbow. Poseidon a step behind, trident planted but not struck. Athena holding the now strung bow across her shoulder like a staff of quiet authority. Apollo with the lyre cradled in one arm, fingers resting on slack strings. Hermes hovering just above the marble, wings beating once, gently, before folding away. They did not speak of forgiveness. They did not speak of punishment. They simply looked down upon the world that had begun to move again, and felt the balance settle, not with a thunderclap, not with ceremony, but with the same inevitability that governs the return of seasons. Zeus lifted his face to the sky. The thunder in his chest stirred, not in anger, but in quiet affirmation. A single bolt flickered along the horizon, distant, restrained, beautiful. The sky answered with a low roll that carried no threat, only recognition. Hera turned her head slightly. A peacock called once from the garden below, clear, proud, alive. She smiled, small and private. Poseidon nodded once toward the sea far below. The first real wave rose, curled, broke against the shore in white foam that sparkled in ordinary sunlight. Athena exhaled. The owl on her shoulder ruffled its feathers, stretched its wings, then settled again. Apollo touched the lyre. A single note drifted outward, simple, resolved, carrying across the mountain and down into the valleys where it was heard without wonder. Only quiet welcome. Hermes rose higher, circled once, then darted downward toward the mortal world, not to deliver messages, but simply to move, to feel air rush past wings that had waited too long to fly. In the cavern Lyros closed his eyes. Not in sleep, not in surrender, simply because he could. The darkness behind his lids was no longer empty. It held everything, every promise, every fracture, every moment of endurance, every returning dawn. And in that darkness he found, at last, the shape of mercy, not as release from chains, but as permission to rest within them. The light that had crept in touched his closed lids, warm now, steady. Above, the mountain exhaled fully. The wind moved again across the peaks, carrying the scent of olive blossom, salt spray, fresh, cut wheat, and something older, something that had waited in silence and now returned without demand. The world turned. Mortals lived on, loving, swearing, breaking vows, mending them, doubting, trusting, enduring. The gods watched, and somewhere, deep in stone that had once been prison, a God who had kept all oaths remembered how to breathe. The story ended there, not with thunder, not with tears, not with grand reconciliation. It ended with the soft click of eyelids closing, with the first ordinary breath after endless awareness, with the quiet certainty that punishment, like everything else, has its season, and when the season passes, what remains is simply presence. Calm, complete, eternal in the only way eternity matters, without the need to prove itself any longer. The listener felt the hush settle, gentle as dusk over hills, and understood that the deepest mercy is not the lifting of chains, but the knowledge that one may finally rest within them. And so the tale closed, timeless, heavy with quiet grace, and carried forward only by the slow, patient rhythm of whatever comes next. Good night,